Welcome once again to another edition of the Osteopathic Lyceum podcast. What we're going to do today is have a further discussion of cranial systems and cranial mechanisms, especially with relation to the development of cranial bones across the lifespan. Some of the fundamental claims of these cranial systems, be it Upledger, be it Sutherland, or whatever other system that you happen to stumble across, is that there is patency of sutures across the lifespan, that the cerebrospinous fluid is pulsatile, or that the nervous system in and of itself is pulsatile, and that these then predict the behavior of practitioners in relation to patients with respect to diagnosis and treatment. Now, what we're going to look at is the observable information regarding these claims as up to date as we're able. So what I will say before I do this is something that I consistently say, is that the work of the practitioners is often positive for the patients, but the claims may not necessarily be what they want to be. They're not valid. They are not what they say they are. So that doesn't undercut positive treatment of a patient or positive interaction with a patient or positive outcome of a patient, but it does undercut the claims of many of these systems, or really all of these systems. So what we'll do is I'm going to share screen here. We're going to look first at the phenomenon of the cranial structures across the lifespan, right? So there is value in understanding this. As I move my video window here. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to look at, and we'll come back to this one after, is this Rethinking the Origin of the Primary Respiratory Mechanism by Bruno Bordoni and Alan R. Escher. Right, so come down to where I want to in here. So we'll look here, or within this article, about the embryology of the occipital and the sphenoid bone. So specifically those, because the sphenobasilar or spheno-occipital synchondrosis is the central naming mechanism of cranial systems. So the underlying assumption is that the basilar portion of the sphenoid and the basilar portion of the occiput have movement in between them that will be termed flexion and extension, and then you'll have the torsions. For that to be the case, you would have to never see ossification of those structures. You would have to see a patent suture. And embryologically, you have the basisphenoid and the presphenoid. You have the lateral regions of the occipital bone. You have I believe it's the superior region, especially the superior posterior region of the occiput. And then you also have the basi-occiput and the spheno-occiput, the basisphenoid and the basi-occiput merge to make the cranial base, and ossification begins relatively early on. So you do have lots of different structures from embryological origin. So the cranium is not complete by any stretch of the imagination embryologically, at least in utero. By the time a baby is born, you have far less identifiable structures, much more union of the cranium. Obviously, the spheno-occipital synchondrosis is not necessarily a synchondrosis upon birth. It is mobile, or has the opportunity to be mobile, as the suture is patent. But what you get is usually by the age of 18 in most reports, the spheno-occipital synchondrosis will be fused, or it will be a synchondrosis. Where are we here? Yeah, so here, a retrospective study of 638 cadavers, 10 to 25 years of age, highlighted an average age of complete ossification of the SOS around 17 years. Moreover, females begin the ossification process about 2 years earlier than males, and that's an average. That's not each female and each male. That's an average. Ossification develops from the superior area of the SOS, so the superior portion, and then will work its way downwards or inferiorly towards the feet. Females begin inferior portion, eventually involving the inferior portion. Another forensic study using living MRIs valued 208 participants, 5 to 30 years. Study lowers the age of detection of complete ossification, where in the male it is 15 years, while in the female the SOS ends at the age of 13. forensic investigation using CT or computed tomography scans with 500 cadavers, an age range of 5 to 25 years, revealed that age of complete ossification of the SOS occurs by 18 years of age. Another study with 198 cadavers, age 18 to 26, described the complete ossification of the SOS for men between 17 and 21, whereas for women, it occurs before approximately 1 to 2 years of age. So first, what you're seeing is a huge amount of variation in the reporting. So the methods are variable, the reporting is variable. There is a difference in genders where females seem to ossify the spheno-occipital synchondrosis earlier than males, but that doesn't mean that's the case. What you're seeing is a variety of methods and a variety of reports. So part of this is always going to depend on the particular cadavers or the particular individuals that they study. But what you're seeing, broadly speaking, if you were to make a grand assumption, assume that by the age of 18, there is absolutely no patency in almost anybody with respect to the base of the cranium or the spheno-occipital synchondrosis. So just expect that that's the case. Now, saying that, that means that at least by the age of 18, and almost anybody would ever find, any mechanistic claim of any cranial approach has no leg to stand on. It has no validity because fusion has occurred in this thing that they say moves. Underneath that, you can make the assumption that it might move a little bit. But what I would say is that because it begins superior on the superior portion and then moves inferior, once some ossification has occurred, you have motion loss, right? It's essentially the beginnings of an ossified joint. So even if you have 5% of it, of the superior portion fused, it's not necessarily going to mean that the rest of the patent suture is going to move much or in a meaningful way. So also in here, you can start to see that there is some, as long as they type this properly, note of ossification in females at a full ossification at 1 to 2 years of age. All right, that seems very conspicuous to me, so that's of interest. I'd have to go back and check the initial paper, but either way, what you see is this huge range for ossification. Partial ossification would also undercut. So it's not like at the age of 18, it goes from a patent suture to a completely fused suture. It's not like that. It's more like at the age of 18, it's complete. So prior to the age of 18, it is incomplete fusion, which means that maybe there is some motion, but because this usually progresses from superior to inferior within the bone or within the two bones, that means that the superior portion, which is the portion that would be most closely related to the internal environment of the cranium, is the thing that doesn't move, which means that any movement, it's kind of window dressing if it's there at all. Patency of a suture doesn't necessarily predict large amounts of movement. So what we have is some understanding from this paper that there are many individual portions of the cranium embryologically that are no longer present at birth, right? So there are lots of individual origins of the bones in the cranium, but by birth, there are far less bones within the cranium or far less individual structures. Right, so evidence of that. We look at StatPros. This is from PubMed. This is an open access, essentially free textbook that is quite strong. The introduction gives us what we need. At birth, the newborn skull consists of 5 major bones, 2 frontal, right? So 2 frontal, 2 parietal, 1 occipital, and they are separated by connective tissue junctions known as cranial sutures. The sutures function as seams, and they are highly necessary to facilitate the movement and molding of the cranium through the birth canal during labor. They also allow for rapid postnatal growth and development of the brain. However, the bones that shape the cranium begin unfused, leaving several gaps between the individual bones of the infant skull. These gaps are composed of membranous connective tissue and are known as fontanelles. So what we see, as noted, there are many structures that are individuated during the embryological period, during gestation, once the baby is born, or at the point that a baby is born. In almost every case, at least with the cranium, not necessarily facial structure, but the neurocranium, visceral cranium, this part, you've got more or less 5 bones that they're talking about. Now, there's more bones because they didn't necessarily mention the temporal bones. They didn't mention the sphenoid, but what is important is to know that you go from many structures, individual, to less structures, and then you have the fontanelles. This allows for the birthing process, and it also allows for rapid growth of the tissue post-delivery or postnatal, in the postnatal period. So there is definitely some requirement at certain points of life for movement of these structures, and that seems to be preserved relatively well, which is one of the reasons why you have these structures present in the way that they are at birth and in early stages. But they continue to fuse across life. Now, this one is the evaluation of the spheno-occipital synchondrosis. Where are we? Yeah, this one isn't going to give us much that we didn't already see in the initial article. Where are we? I'm going to go down here. Yeah, this actually will, this is for age estimation. This paper is attempting to use the spheno-occipital synchondrosis as age estimation in forensic study. So I'll read the conclusion here. Age estimation by closure of spheno-occipital synchondrosis has a limited utility in forensic casework owing to the wide variability in its age of closure as presented in various studies, and thus it can be concluded that the closure has only very general relationship with age. The onset, progress, and obliteration of suture closure is observed to be so erratic that it just provides a general pattern at various age levels. Thus, it acts as a guide rather than a determining feature in age estimation, and such a trend is of limited use in modern forensic anthropology. It only acts as a supportive evidence for age estimation in the presence of other more determinate and accurate clues. Suture closure may possibly be affected by nutritional and health status of the deceased, allometric growth, general growth and development of the bones, and to some extent by race. It may also be affected by exercise and physical activity of an individual. These factors may have possible and reasonable influences that could explain the variability observed in the age of the closure of the synchondrosis. So you're looking at essentially not a complete meta-analysis, but some level of meta-analysis of research available about the spheno-occipital synchondrosis and its usefulness or utility or validity or reliability in assessing age in forensic studies. And the notation is that it's so generally erratic that it's not particularly useful. It's kind of a general guide. Now, in healthcare, where you're attempting to identify internal structures from the outside or the external environmental observation, this becomes of much less utility because you literally have no idea what's going on with that spheno-occipital synchondrosis. The evidence that's available, broadly speaking, would tell you that any assumption that you make or any belief that you have about the spheno-occipital synchondrosis is exceptionally general at best. You're probably incorrect about the individual that you're working with. So the evidence that we already have, that it seems that the fusion of the suture or the ossification of the suture starts from the superior portion or the portion internal to the skull and goes inferior towards the feet, means that relatively early on, you're losing patency of that suture in a meaningful way to any cranial claim, the flexion, extension, or torsion of the sphenoid and the occiput in relation to one another. So you lose that exceptionally early, or if you don't lose it early, it's weird, right? So you probably don't have any of this available to you, even with relatively young patients. And it's so erratic that you can't rely on it. It is not trustworthy. It's not a trustworthy phenomenon, even if it does exist. Okay. Now, here's something that I want to point to with respect to the patency or the opening and closing of sutures. And superficially, this could look like it's a possible win for cranial claims. However, if you look at the reporting, it's probably not. So the first thing to note is patency of a suture does not necessarily tell you how much movement could or might be available, or if any is available at all, or how much, right? So it doesn't give you any information about that. Observing patency of a suture doesn't necessarily support any form of claim of movement or the identification of movement in the cranium. It simply provides observation of patency of a suture. Right, so I'm going to read the highlighted portion here because it has a lot of value. We conducted an institutional Review board approved retrospective study examining 3-dimensionally reconstructed head CT scans performed between 2017 and 2022 at a tertiary academic medical center. Beginning at age 18, 5 male and 5 female patients from each decade of life were included. Inclusion criteria required CT imaging of the head for non-traumatic indications. Patients with any history of bony craniofacial trauma were excluded. The metopic, sagittal, coronal, squamosal, and lambdoid sutures from each scan were graded on a scale of 0 to 4 according to the following scheme. 0 is open, so no fusion. Grade 1 is 1% to 33% fused. So if you see grade 1, it's somewhere between 1 and 33% fused. You don't know where, you just know that it's between that. Grade 2, 34 to 66% fused. Again, you don't know if it's 34, 35, 36, 61, 62. You don't know, you just know it's between there if you see grade 2. Grade 3, 67 to 99% fused. So you don't know if it's 68, 73, 75, 98. You don't know. You just know that if you see 3, it's somewhere in there. Grade 4, completely obliterated. Mean closure grades from each decade were compared with timeframes reported in the literature for suture fusion. Okay, so there's a good amount of data that has validity in that it is observing these sutures and you're able to identify the presence or absence of closure. The grading scale is a range, right? So you are assigning a whole number to a range. When reporting this range, there is no identification whether or not whatever fusion is noted with any grade is continuous or discontinuous. So you don't know if it's 33%, so it starts here and ends here, or if it's 5%, 6%, 7% in varying places. That would lead to a total estimation of 33%. You don't know if this is from top to bottom, right? So it's fused continuously from inferior to superior, but only about 33% of the way up. It doesn't tell you that. So you don't know what this fusion report means. You just know that they're providing a report. Now, a further or a larger method section would probably let us know this. It may be available. You may be able to correspond with the authors. The authors being Luke Solomon, Sophia On, I believe is how you would say that, Victor Hunt, Nikki Sobti, and Albert S. Wu. So you don't know how they're grading this or what they're grading, but you know that there is a range within there. Now, the other thing is that when you do some form of statistical averaging with a scale like that, you are not going to get back a whole number. So if you have 85 scores, and 10 of them are 0, and 5 of them are 1, and 20 of them are 2, you add that up and you average it over however many, you're going to get a non-whole number. Now, when you get that non-whole number returned as your average for a particular suture closure within each decade of life, the problem that you're going to run into is that it would be easy for people to interpret that as somewhere in the continuum of your grade. So between 0 and 1, if it's a score of 0.6, well, maybe I can think that between 1 and 33, we're somewhere in the, we're somewhere between, we're probably around 20% sutural fusion. It's not what it means. It just means that in some people, it wasn't fused at all. In some people, it was fused a little bit, so it could be completely patent, or you're not picking that up. But what you do get is some interesting information. So if we look at any suture between the age of 18 to 29, the metopic suture is generally completely fused in everybody, or at least the subjects that they examined. But then you go to 30 to 39, and it's 3.6 all of a sudden. This would probably mean that there was some portion that were somewhere between 67 and 99%, and then completely fused. So this 3.6 is indicative of 67 to 99% on some of the subjects. But you don't know if it was 67, you don't know if it was 99, you don't know where in between, but you just get this funny score, right? Whereas then what you see in every other age bracket, because of the individual's CT scans that they had, it's completely fused, right? So this looks like, oh, wow, there's something funny happening there. There really isn't. They're probably almost completely fused. It's just there was somebody that had to score a 3, or a few people that had to score a 3. The sagittal 0.8, 0.1, 0.7, 0.4. So you see this looks at least erratic, right? So with the individuals between 30 and 39, you probably had almost nobody with some fusion. You probably had completely patent sutures on those. You probably had people with a decent amount of fusion, somewhere between 1 and 33% in the 18 to 29. And then you probably had more people with 1 to 33% in the age of 60 to 69, right? So you can see that. What you do see is relatively low scores for most of these sutures through all of these decades, right? You see low scores. That means there is patency. It also means that, generally speaking, most of the people you're going to find in here are probably going to be between 1 and 33% fused in most of these sutures that they're looking at with the samples that they had. That doesn't mean that you have patent sutures. So if I had a suture like this, and it was fused here, and fused here, essentially you could think of that as welds. That would suggest that the points in between those fusions are not going to move all that well. If the report is from inferior to superior, and it's completely fused on the inferior side, well, the stuff on top of it is probably not going to move all that much. So when you have some degree of fusion, you've probably lost meaningful motion in that suture, regardless of how it's occurring. So just because you see something like this doesn't mean you can lean into it and say, oh, wow, that totally means that the sutures are patent through most of life, and that totally means that they move. No, it doesn't. You have to understand what you're looking at, and also what the information you're not getting. So you're not really getting much about how these fusions are occurring, right? And that matters to a large degree. Now, what I want to do here, I'll bring this video back out, is take a look at this information on cerebrospinous fluid dynamics. Where are we going to go? So I'm going to first read. So this is from 2021. So there are newer methods for MRI to observe many things, and this includes cerebrospinous fluid. So I'll read the general abstract, and then I'll get into something a little bit later, and then I will show you how one of the things that we get into would then predict a particular behavior, because if you see evidence of something and then you think that that's the way to do it, you can do some interesting stuff to people. Classical cerebrospinal fluid CSF circulation theory has been accepted as an established theory of CSF physiology. It describes bulk CSF flow from production site to absorption site. However, much controversy remains regarding the basic CSF physiology and the mechanisms behind development of hydrocephalus. In the recent observations made using advanced magnetic resonance imaging MRI technology or technique, namely the time spatial inversion pulse time slip method, CSF was used as an internal CSF tracer to trace true CSF movement. Observation of the CSF dynamics using this method reveals aspects of CSF dynamics that are different from those of classical CSF circulation theory. Cerebrospinous fluid shows pulsation but does not show bulk flow from production site to absorption site, a theory that was built upon externally injected tracer studies. Observation of the exogenous tracer studies were true but misinterpreted. Causes of misinterpretations are the differences between the results obtained using true CSF tracer and exogenous tracers. A better understanding of the real CSF physiology can be significant for the advancement of medical sciences in the future. Revisiting CSF flow physiology is a necessary step towards this goal. Okay, so what you see there is that varying methods will give you varying observations, and then the interpretations that come from those will make sense based on the constraints of those observations. So you can make a mistake based on how you observed. This relates well to any hands-on therapy because you're observing from the outside, which means that if you take the information that you observe from the outside of the patient to mean something internal, and you're in any way wrong, then you've made an error of interpretation, right? This is a consistent feature. The interpretive step of the observation, based on the assumptions related to the observation, can have problems. If there's any problem in the assumption, then there's a problem with the interpretation, right? So you build mistakes into your approach. What I would claim is that the vast majority of the interpretation done in osteopathy has this problem, okay? So we will scroll down to the spot that I would like to. This is an interesting article. Here we go. That's the one. So I'm going to read what is highlighted. After the MRI time slip was developed to visualize movement of CSF due to respiration, further attention had been directed to the importance of breathing to the movement of CSF. Since there is no regularity between cardiac beat and respiration, the actual movement of CSF does not pulsate regularly. Continuous fast acquisition time slip method has been developed to capture the real CSF motion. Let me see what this says. When using the real-time time slip method for visualizing CSF movement in the cerebral activocilius, the pulsatile movement due to respiration and that caused by cardiac beat can not only be seen but also captured in the same sequence. Okay, so talk about rhythm. The claim in most cranial systems of being able to palpate a rhythm that is independent of heart rate and independent of respiration, usually closer in frequency to respiration, but also not in any way similar to heart rate. That claim with respect to external palpation of an internal pulsatility that has an independent frequency to these things, when observing the thing that they say they can feel the pulsation of, which is CSF, there is no observation whatsoever of that independent frequency of pulsation. Now, somebody could make the hypothesis, which would be a prediction based on this information, that because of the irregularity between heart rate and respiration, that what is really happening is these fantastic hands and this fantastic brain that a particular cranial practitioner has is taking the aggregate and doing the math on the combined pulsation of heart rate and respiration, and then that's the PRM. I will go ahead and say you have to absolutely be nuts to believe that. So anybody who tries to throw that at you, I will predict they can kick rocks and suck salt. So there is no identifiable PRM. There is no identifiable fluctuation of CSF that is regular and that could be identified externally that would not be indicative of either heart rate or respiration. What you're probably feeling, or what people are probably claiming, especially because most cranial palpation or most palpation of the cranium in cranial methodologies is done in supine, is probably respiration. That is the rate that it lines up best with when reported. So the superficial hypothesis, or the principle of parsimony, would say all data taken together, making the fewest assumptions possible. Most people talking about cranial rhythmicity or CSF rhythmicity are probably talking about respiration. That is not necessarily proven, but it is the most parsimonious prediction that could then be tested in a way that would break it. And if you don't break it, there you go. So if anybody would like a research idea, go ahead and try to figure out the claims of cranial pulsation in relation to an individual's respiration, and you'll probably find a correlation there. So go ahead and give that a shot. The next piece that I want to point at in this paper is the acceleration of removal of waste material from the brain by shaking the head. So if you are an evidence-based practitioner and you like this idea, or you like the idea of looking at what the evidence says and then creating treatments as a result of it, you can be like, oh, well, we can accelerate the removal of the waste material from the brain by shaking the head. That's not necessarily what they're talking about here. What they're talking about here, and if you read this, so the ISF of the brain and the CSF have the same composition and can freely exchange. Recently, as the lymphatic system has been discovered, it has been attracting attention as a pathway for discharging waste material from the brain. It's already happening. Please excuse my diversion from reading. It's already happening. Lymphatic exchange between the CSF and the ISF and the lymphatic system, it's already happening. External methods are not likely to improve on a system that pre-exists. It's already happening. So just because we found it and we can observe it now doesn't mean it's going to change your behavior. It's already happening. Anyways, let me go back into this. It has been attracting attention as a pathway for discharging waste material from the brain. In the lymphatic system, there's a circulation which the CSF flows into the ISF from around the cerebral arteries, passes through the veins, and returns to the CSF. The truth has not yet been elucidated. However, it has long been known that albumin, PEG, or inulin injected into the brain can pass through the perivascular space and eventually drain into the deep cervical lymphatic system. The brain microinjection method was developed by a group that focused on the interaction between ISF and CSF. This method, the tracer selected, is that's details that you don't need. Hold on. This is where I want to be. It's possible that shaking the head greatly agitates the ISF and CSF and accelerates the drainage of waste products from the brain. The resting state indicates a sleeping state, and the state of shaking the head is related to states of daily living. Okay, so if you want to take the headline and shake the head to increase the movement of waste from the brain into circulation, it's already happening. It's sleeping and being awake and moving. That's all it is. So to attempt to turn that into a treatment, just tell somebody to wake up and move. That's it, right? So if I were to try to develop something, I'm going to close this here, based on available evidence, making the claim that the evidence tells me that, there is rhythmicity of the CSF and it can be palpated, then I would have to ignore the information we now have about the rhythmicity. And the rhythmicity is generated from respiration and from heart rate, right? So you've got the nice closed box, the arteries are going to beat, there's going to be a wave. You're going to notice that it's going to disturb everything within the vault. Respiration is going to pull on, it makes everything move because you have such a major change in diameter of the torso. Really, you could say the thorax, but the torso, generally speaking, because the abdomen is also going to move. It's going to put tension on and off a lot of structures that will pull on anything that happens to be connected. Well, all tissue is continuous and connected. So yeah, it's going to move the brain. It's going to move the brain box. To say that you're feeling this independent rhythm just isn't supported by anything. To say that, well, we now have the information about the lymphatics and shaking the head is the thing that helps the removal of waste. That doesn't mean shake the patient's head. That just means that the patient already has a system. It's already working. The only thing that you could probably do to meaningfully help that, let's just say you want to be a little bit more abstract. The major motion of the brain is determined, or the CSF is determined by respiration, or thoracic respiration, as well as by the heart rate. So let's just say there is some major thing in the body that is making it harder for the torso to expand and contract. Find that movement problem. There you go. There is the thing that is going to help move CSF. As far as the heart rate is concerned, let's just say you find something as a major peripheral obstruction as far as muscular tension or contracture, that would be increasing systemic vascular resistance, right? A really super contracted bicep so that the elbow never wants to straighten out. Okay, well, deal with that. Now the heart rate is likely to do a better job of moving fluid throughout the body and then also impacting the fluid within the brain. So wherever the movement problem is, especially the large movement problem, if you identify it, then whatever knock-on effect it has within the cerebral space, it's going to have. Attempting to swish the thing that observably barely moves and probably doesn't move much at all, although there is evidence of patency of sutures, but we don't know what that means, at least with the information that we have available to us now. The patency of those sutures, you'd have to have it completely patent all the way through and completely patent at all points, because any little point that it fuses could be considered a spot weld, and that would restrict free movement. So that movement is probably gone when almost any fusion starts to happen. So the cranial claims just don't stand up to observation, especially more rigorous and more valid and more accurate observation. So yes, embryologically, there's lots of different individual pieces that fuse together to a certain point. At birth, they're not completely fused so that you can pass through the birth canal and so that your brain can grow and so that the pressure fluctuations have some release mechanism. The primary pressure relief mechanism for the cranium is actually mostly at the carotid canal. No, not the carotid canal. The jugular foramen. That's where fluid goes out. Fluid comes in varying places, but the jugular foramen is where most of the fluid comes out, right? Especially on the venous and lymphatic side. So the SCM can be considered the main blow-off valve or the main pressure release valve. However, the SCM is probably not that big a deal, where the ability to change the volume of the torso is probably a bigger deal because it's the bigger pump. It's the bigger driver of motion of fluid throughout the entire body, including in the cranium. So you could get really, really specific and think that you found it, or you can get a little bit more abstract and say, wherever the movement problem I happen to find is, that's where I'm going to work because that's the obstruction. So The cranial concept, unfortunately, while it does include relatively valid observations, yeah, there's patency of sutures throughout the lifespan, not completely patent, varying degrees of patency depending on who you look at and when you look at them. Yes, there is rhythmicity of cerebrospinous fluid, but it is really heart rate and respiration. So the PRM, not observable, it's not there. So across the lifespan, yeah, sure, maybe this patency is there, and maybe there is changes in CSF flow, but your two larger mechanisms are respiration and heart rate. So if you're going to pay attention to those, you're probably going to have a better impact. One of the better ways to maintain good heart rate, good respiration, as far as general physiological functions, is actually exercise, right? So exercise is probably more valuable to the patient for cerebrospinous fluid dynamics than cranial osteopathy ever could even dream to be, right? So unfortunately, the claims of cranial just don't support the behavior of cranial. The behavior of cranial probably has some positive benefit to the patient. We have positive patient reports. There's something there. We should really investigate it, but we should also take the information that we now have. There's no identifiable rhythm that relates to the PRM. The patency of sutures doesn't necessarily indicate the motion that one would say that they feel. We should figure that out. And we should also say that the fundamental concept of osteopathy is wherever there's a motion obstruction that's identifiable is where the work should be done. That being a very useful method, especially on larger mechanisms such as heart rate and respiration, we have something very strong to offer. So let's do that instead of trying to focus on this minutia and continue chasing this minutia that we are individually invested in or culturally invested in. It's not helping the patient. It's not helping us. It's making us across time look more dogmatic. If we want to say osteopathy is a science and a philosophy, or even that any claim that osteopathy is a science, continue to act this way is not helping. So hopefully that was useful, and we'll talk again soon.